I never thought taking down a pool would turn into something this dramatic. It was just a quiet Sunday morning by the lake, and I'd finally decided to remove the old above-ground pool in my backyard. It had served its time-rusted frame, torn liner, and more leaves than water. Honestly, it was becoming more of a hazard than a hangout spot. I had the tools ready, a rented dumpster parked out front, and figured I'd wrap it all up before noon. What I didn't expect was the HOA showing up within an hour, clipboards in hand and scowls on their faces. Now, I've dealt with the HOA before. We've had our fair share of disagreements, like when they sent me 3 notices for a flower bed being 2 inches over the approved zone. But this time felt different. One of the board members, Carol, who's known around here for watching every move through her blinds, came marching over like I was tearing down a public monument. "Do you have prior written approval for this pool removal?" she asked, arms crossed, lips pursed. I calmly explained that the pool wasn't permanent and wasn't part of any structural build. But logic doesn't go very far when someone's already made up their mind. Before I knew it, Carol was dialing 911, not exaggerating, telling the dispatcher there was unauthorized demolition and potential damage to shared lakefront property. I was stunned. I wasn't anywhere near the shared path or the water line. This was entirely within my yard, well away from anything the HOA claimed authority over. My neighbors were even watching from their porches, some shaking their heads, others recording just in case things escalated. When the police arrived, I honestly thought I'd have to explain myself in detail, maybe show proof of ownership and some local code. But what happened next surprised everyone, including me. The officer wasn't too concerned about my pool, but something else caught his attention entirely. Something that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the HOA themselves. That moment shifted everything. So how did I end up being the one not getting the warning? And what exactly did the officer find that turned the spotlight away from my so-called pool crime and back on the HOA? Let's just say this lakefront drama was just getting started. This little backyard project stirred up way more than fallen leaves and pool debris. Stick around, because you won't believe what came next as the officer walked past me toward the edge of my yard. He paused to take a quick look at the dismantled pool. I explained how I drained it properly, followed the disposal rules, and even had a permit from the city for the dumpster in my driveway. He nodded without saying much. Shh. But then, something over by the lake caught his eye. He turned to Carol and asked, "Is that construction over there part of the HOA's property?" Her face tightened instantly. "It's an approved upgrade," she said quickly, too quickly, if you ask me. I followed his gaze. Just past the path, near the tree line, was a small wooden deck with a railing and a storage shed that definitely hadn't been there last summer. It looked new, fresh wood, clean lines, not weathered like anything that had been there long. I had noticed it before, but didn't think much of it. I figured maybe it was part of a trail expansion or a new sitting area for residents. But the officer seemed curious. He asked who gave permission for it to be built. And that's when Carol's voice started to shake a bit. While she scrambled for answers, I took a breath and started to put the pieces together. That shed wasn't just a new addition. It had no sign, no public notice, and it was sitting way too close to the lake. Definitely not within city code. But more importantly, it wasn't approved by all the residents. I would have remembered a vote on that, especially if it used HOA funds. The officer stepped off the main path and walked toward the deck, calling in a second unit over his radio. Carol tried to follow him, but he politely asked her to stay back for safety reasons. Meanwhile, some of the neighbors began to gather near the edge of my driveway. It was that mix of concern and curiosity you see when something unusual happens in a normally quiet neighborhood. One of them, Mark, leaned over and whispered, "You know, I always wondered what they were doing back there." They had workers come in early mornings before most people were awake. Another neighbor added, "I asked about it once, and Carol told me it was none of my concern." That's when it hit me. This wasn't about my pool at all. The HOA had made a habit of flexing their authority over the little things to keep everyone distracted. Meanwhile, something bigger, maybe even unauthorized, was being built right under our noses. And now that the police were involved, it wasn't just a neighborly argument anymore. But still, the question remained, what exactly was inside that shed? The second patrol car pulled up slowly, lights flashing but no sirens. Two more officers stepped out, one of them carrying a clipboard and what looked like zoning maps. Carol's confidence had all but vanished. She kept adjusting her sunglasses, even though the sun was already setting behind the trees. I stood back, trying not to look too smug, but I could feel that the balance had shifted. This wasn't just about me taking down an old pool anymore. This was something deeper. And if I was right, the HOA might have been hiding a lot more than an extra deck by the lake, while the officers started measuring distances from the shed to the water line. One of them asked for any HOA documentation showing construction approval. Carol hesitated, then muttered something about the paperwork being in the clubhouse. That was convenient. The clubhouse was locked, and only a few people had access. I'd tried to attend a budget meeting there once, only to be told it was members only, even though I pay dues like everyone else. That had always rubbed me the wrong way. Mark, who had stuck around by my driveway, suddenly spoke up. "A few months ago, I saw a truck parked out there, no company name, no license plates. Guys in plain clothes bringing in big crates. I figured maybe it was just garden supplies." Another neighbor chimed in. They told me it was a bird watching deck for the community, but I haven't seen a single bench or sign since it went up. The crowd was growing, and so were the questions. Back at the shed, the officers discovered something strange. The door was padlocked tight knot, just with a standard lock, but with a heavy-duty chain like you'd see on storage units. The officer radioed for permission to inspect, but they needed someone from the HOA board to open it. Carol fumbled with her phone, claiming she didn't have the key and that only the HOA president could unlock it. But he was conveniently out of town on a cruise. She said now the tension wasn't just between me and the HOA, it was between the board and the entire neighborhood. People were starting to realize how much power had been handed over. Without question, the HOA had always enforced the small things: mailbox colors, lawn height, even seasonal decorations, but now it seemed they might be operating under a whole different rulebook. When it came to themselves, what were they storing back there? Why all the secrecy? And why was Carol so nervous if everything was above board? The pool situation had exposed more than I ever expected. And as night crept in, that locked shed by the lake became the center of everyone's attention. By the time the sun had completely dipped below the lake, casting a dark orange glow over the water, the entire mood of the neighborhood had shifted. What started as a quiet backyard project had turned into a full-blown standoff between frustrated homeowners, curious cops, and a suddenly silent HOA. More neighbors had gathered near the walking trail, whispering, pointing toward the locked shed, wondering what had been going on right under their noses. It wasn't just about HOA drama anymore. There was something strange, maybe even unsettling, about how secretive the board had been about this structure by the lake. Carol stood at the edge of the path, now clearly avoiding eye contact. She kept glancing at her phone, waiting for someone to call back, probably the HOA president, or maybe a lawyer. But the officers weren't waiting around. One of them started taking photos of the shed and the unpermitted deck attached to it, noting how it extended well into the protected lake buffer zone. Another officer quietly spoke into his radio, requesting guidance from a supervisor. You could feel it in the air, something was about to break open. Then someone in the crowd, Jenny, who lived across the lake, spoke up. "I walked by here early last week. There were power tools going at like 6 a.m., and I swear I saw them hauling in big containers, but they wouldn't let anyone near. They said it was for community storage, but what kind of storage needs a chain that thick? Another neighbor nodded. And why didn't we vote on any of this? They raise our dues for flower beds, but now they're building private storage spaces in secret. The questions kept stacking, and so did the tension. One of the officers asked Carol again, firmly this time, to contact whoever had the shed keys. She stammered something about needing board approval first. That's when the officer calmly replied, "If this structure is on public access lakefront property and it's in violation of city code, we're going to need to inspect it with or without a key." That single sentence sent a ripple through the crowd. Everyone was on edge now, and Carol looked pale. She pulled the officer aside, whispering something that none of us could hear. Whatever she said, it didn't seem to help. He stepped away from her, nodded to the others, and called in for further instructions. I stood there, still in work gloves and covered in dust from my pool project, watching this unfold. It was surreal. The HOA had turned my cleanup into a scene, but in doing so, they'd brought attention to something they clearly didn't want anyone to see. And now, the shed door was one call away from being opened and whatever was inside was about to come to light. Just when we thought things couldn't get more tense, supervisor arrived. A plain SUV rolled up with no lights, no sound, just quiet authority. A taller man in a windbreaker stepped out, flashing a badge, but not saying much. He walked straight over to the officers already on scene and asked for an update. As they briefed him in low voices, the rest of us just stood there, neighbors turned spectators, watching it all unfold like a movie none of us expected to be a part of. I caught a glimpse of Carol pacing behind a tree, furiously texting. Her hands were shaking now. Then, something happened that no one was ready for. The supervisor pointed at the shed and said something quietly. One of the officers nodded, walked over, and began inspecting the hinges. They were clearly preparing to force it open. That's when a voice shouted from the trail. Wait! Everyone turned. It was Mr. Lawson, the HOA treasurer. He hadn't been seen at any meetings for months and was rumored to have resigned quietly after some disagreement. But here he was, sweating and out of breath, like he'd just sprinted across the neighborhood. He had a ring of keys in his hand. Without even asking, one of the officers waved him over. Carol looked like she'd seen a ghost. "Don't do this," she hissed under her breath, but it was too late. Lawson, with a look that was somewhere between guilt and relief, handed the keys to the officer. "They'll find out anyway," he muttered. "Might as well open it now." The officer unlocked the heavy chain and slowly pulled the door open. We all leaned forward, holding our breath. But instead of some dramatic contraband or suspicious equipment, what we saw was empty shelves. Just rows of wooden racks and a faint smell of fresh paint. For a moment, it almost felt like a letdown. But then the officer stepped in deeper and motioned for another flashlight. He shined it on the floor where a pile of sealed envelopes had been stacked in the corner, partially hidden under a tarp. One officer picked one up and read the label out loud. "Private assessments do not disclose." Carol's face went stone cold. Lawson spoke again, quieter this time. "Those are off-the-books fines. They've been collecting them quietly. From selected homeowners, no record in the official reports. No votes, no appeals." The crowd gasped. Even the officers looked surprised. This wasn't just about a shed anymore. This was something bigger. And suddenly, the pool incident didn't just feel like a misunderstanding. It felt like the trigger that exposed a system people had been too afraid or too tired to question. The moment those words left Lawson's mouth, everything shifted. The quiet murmurs turned into full-blown outrage. Neighbors started speaking up. One woman said she was charged $300 for a fence post that was too modern. Another mentioned getting mystery late fees even though she paid on time. People were realizing those odd charges and unexplained. Fines weren't isolated incidents. They were part of something organized, something hidden. The officers began snapping photos of the envelopes while the supervisor radioed in what he called potential financial misconduct. Carol stayed frozen, her arms crossed tight against her chest, as if holding herself together. Then came the biggest blow, as the officers opened more of the envelopes. They found handwritten notes attached to some "do not log, call first," and even one that said, "threatened legal action, keep quiet." It was clear this wasn't just sloppy paperwork. It was a coordinated effort to charge selective fines and pocket the payments off the record. That explained the new shed, the unapproved deck, even the odd hours the construction crews came in. HOA dues, off the books, penalties, and even donations had been funneled into pet projects the board kept hidden. The supervisor stepped forward and calmly asked Carol to step aside with him. She didn't argue. She just nodded and walked away, head down. No cuffs, no shouting, just quiet consequences. Lawson stayed behind, his voice low as he explained how he tried to stop it months ago, but was pushed out. "They threatened to ruin me if I spoke up," he said. "But I couldn't watch them do this to people anymore." The officers sealed the envelopes into evidence bags while the rest of us stood there, still trying to process what just happened. The entire HOA board would be investigated, and until then, their authority was officially suspended. It felt surreal. One minute I was breaking down an old pool, and the next, I was standing in the middle of a full-on HOA scandal that exposed hidden fees, secret structures, and years of mistrust. Just when the tension started to ease, a final twist surfaced. One of the officers walked back from behind the shed, holding a small, dust-covered box. Inside, a phone still on, blinking with unread messages. It wasn't Carol's, and it wasn't Lawson's. The officer scrolled, then paused. "Looks like these were HOA board group chats," he said. "Some of these messages go back over a year, mentioning payments, covering up votes, even targeting specific homeowners." That's when I realized this whole thing wasn't just about shady money. It was personal. And I had been one of their targets all along. Over the next few days, everything started to unfold like dominoes. With the shed opened and the phone handed over to authorities, a full investigation kicked off. Carol and 2 other board members resigned almost immediately. The HOA president, still on that so-called cruise, sent in his resignation via email. Turns out, the vacation had been planned right after the construction was completed, probably a backup plan in case things went south. And they did. Neighbors began stepping forward with their own stories, late fees for rules that didn't exist, extra charges for inspections no one ever scheduled, threats for small violations that mysteriously disappeared after someone donated to the HOA fund. It was like peeling back a layer none of us realized was there. The lake shed had been more than just a storage space. It was the cover for an entire system of mismanagement, quiet pressure, unfair treatment. The city took over temporary oversight of our HOA operations. A new election was scheduled, and this time it wasn't behind closed doors. I was asked to be on the temporary advisory board, and even though I didn't plan on getting involved, I said yes. After what had happened, I knew I couldn't just go back to trimming my hedges and hoping someone else would do the right thing. As for my pool, it was gone. Sure, but so were the fines, the warnings, and the constant nitpicking. The officer who first arrived that day even followed up a week later just to make sure everything was settled. "Funny how it started with you just cleaning up your own yard," he said. Sometimes that's all it takes to shake a system that's gotten too comfortable. Lawson moved back into a more active role with the new HOA structure. He told us he'd been trying to protect residents for a long time but never had support. "The hardest part," he said, "was feeling like I was the only one who saw it. Now, with more eyes watching and better transparency, It felt like we were finally moving toward something healthier. The biggest takeaway for me was simple. Silence is what lets bad systems grow. We'd all been too quiet, too trusting, thinking it was just how things worked. But all it took was one honest action, taking down an old pool to shine light on what had been hidden for years. So yeah, the HOA called the cops on me for removing my lake pool. But in the end, I wasn't the one who got the warning, they were. And now, our neighborhood has a chance to rebuild. Not just our yards or fences, but trust.